near-death experiences that revealed horrors. This is one of those childhood stories that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. I was 8 years old when it happened. My parents had taken me to a family resort deep in the woods of upstate New York. It was October. The leaves were fiery reds and oranges, and the crisp air carried the smell of bonfires and damp earth. Halloween decorations lined the cabins, and the resort felt like a scene from a postcard, except for the unsettling silence that settled in after sunset. I was a timid kid, the kind who clung to my parents at the slightest hint of the unfamiliar. My mom used to joke that I was like a shadow, always trailing behind her. But that weekend, I was determined to prove I wasn't afraid of being on my own. Looking back, I wish I hadn't tried so hard. The resort had a charm to it during the day, but as the light faded, so did its warmth. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer. On our first night there, I remember staring out the window of our cabin and seeing something strange. A faint glow coming from the edge of the forest. My dad told me it was probably just another guest's flashlight, but even then, it didn't feel right. I should have stayed inside. I should have listened to that prickling feeling at the back of my neck. But I didn't. The next morning I woke early, determined to explore the resort on my own. The cabins were arranged in a loose horseshoe around a central field where families played volleyball and kids rode bikes. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But as I walked further from the bustle, following a winding concrete path into the woods, the chatter of the other guests faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. I told myself I wasn't scared, even as the silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The path led to a small, run-down building, a maintenance shed maybe. It was old, with peeling paint and a single cracked window covered in grime. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, but then I noticed something. The window wasn't just dirty, it was fogged up as if someone was inside breathing against the glass. That didn't make sense. It was cold outside, and the shed didn't look like it had power, let alone heat. I took a step closer, curiosity outweighing the unease bubbling in my stomach. Behind the fogged glass, a shape began to form, tall, thin, vaguely human. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe some Halloween decoration someone had put there as a joke. But then it moved. The figure shifted, its head tilting slowly to one side, as if it was looking directly at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. For a second, I was convinced it was just my imagination. But when I blinked, it was still there. I turned and bolted back toward the cabins, the sound of my sneakers slapping against the concrete, breaking the eerie stillness. I didn't stop until I was back at our cabin, slamming the door behind me. "Everything okay?" my mom asked, her voice light, oblivious. She was packing sandwiches for the day, my dad scrolling through a map of nearby hiking trails. They didn't notice the sweat on my brow or the way my hands trembled as I grabbed a water bottle. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to sound casual. "Just went for a walk." But I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the window. It felt like it had seen me. Later that afternoon, I convinced myself to go back. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a reflection, maybe a mannequin someone had left behind. I needed to prove that I hadn't been scared of nothing. When I returned to the shed, the figure was gone. But the window wasn't empty. On the glass, drawn in the condensation, was a single handprint. It wasn't mine. That night I couldn't sleep. The handprint on the window haunted me, replaying in my mind like a scratched record. My parents were snoring softly in their bed across the cabin, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the wooden walls. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The room felt too quiet. Even the faint hum of crickets outside had stopped, leaving behind a silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I glanced at the window near my bed, my heart thudding in my chest. At first, there was nothing, just the pale outline of trees in the moonlight. But then I saw it. A shape moved past the window, slow and deliberate, like it wanted me to see it. My breath caught as the silhouette stopped directly in front of the glass. It was the same figure I'd seen in the shed, tall and thin, its outline impossibly still, like it wasn't breathing. I froze, barely able to blink. The figure tilted its head, just as it had earlier, and then it leaned closer to the window. The faint glow of moonlight illuminated a face, or what should have been a face. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over a skull that seemed too long, too angular. Its eyes were deep hollows, blacker than the night itself, and its mouth wasn't a mouth at all. It was a gaping, jagged slash that curved upward in a grotesque mockery of a smile, and it was smiling at me. I threw the blanket over my head, clutching it tightly, willing myself to believe that I was dreaming, that if I just closed my eyes, it would be gone. But even with the blanket shielding me, I could feel its presence. A faint tapping sound broke the silence. Light, deliberate, coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like it was trying to get my attention. My chest felt like it might explode as I fought to stay still, every fiber of my being screaming at me to look, to make sure it wasn't coming closer. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then I heard the floorboards creak. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains, I bolted out of bed, desperate to tell my parents. But when I reached the window, there was no sign of the figure, no smudges, no footprints. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been a nightmare. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. Scratched into the wood beneath the window, so faint I almost missed it, was a message. Don't go back. I couldn't shake the words carved beneath the window. Don't go back. It followed me through the day, a constant whisper in my head, gnawing at my thoughts. I tried to tell my parents, but they brushed it off. My mom thought I'd been watching too many scary movies, and my dad laughed, calling it my Halloween imagination. I didn't have the heart to argue, but I knew something wasn't right. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see that figure again, staring back at me. I avoided the woods altogether, sticking close to the other guests. But the feeling of unease followed me like a shadow. That evening, while everyone was gathered around the bonfire, I found myself wandering away. I didn't mean to. My feet moved on their own, as if something was pulling me toward the woods. The resort was noisy behind me. Laughter, the crackle of flames. But the moment I stepped onto the concrete path leading to the shed, the noise vanished, replaced by the eerie quiet of the forest. The shed loomed ahead, the windows still fogged despite the chill in the air. I wanted to turn back, but my legs wouldn't listen. A part of me needed to see it again, to prove to myself that it wasn't real, or at least understand what it was. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The fogged window was different this time. Instead of a single handprint, the entire surface was smeared with streaks, as if something, or someone, had been frantically clawing at it from the inside. And then I saw the figure. It was closer now, pressed against the glass like it was trying to push through. Its skeletal fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns in the fog, leaving behind streaks that resembled letters. H-E-L-P. The word sent a jolt of fear through me. Was it asking for help? Or was it mocking me, playing some sick game? I didn't have time to think before the figure's movements changed. It leaned back from the glass, its head tilting unnaturally far to one side, and then it smiled. Its mouth, impossibly wide, split across its face as it raised one hand and slowly waved at me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart screamed for me to run, but my legs felt glued to the spot. The figure moved closer to the window, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. And then the glass shattered. The sound ripped through the silence, sending shards flying in every direction. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I tore through the forest, branches whipping against my face and arms. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the cabins, gasping for air, everything was normal. Families laughed around the bonfire, kids roasted marshmallows, and no one seemed to notice the terror etched on my face. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the figure was gone. But deep down I knew better. Just before I drifted off to sleep, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the cabin door. The tapping at the door froze me in place. My whole body felt paralyzed, like my limbs were filled with lead. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't frantic or loud, but steady and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was on the other side knew I was awake. My parents didn't stir. The room was completely still, except for the sound of my shallow breathing and the tapping that wouldn't stop. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or some animal, but deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. My bare feet touched the cold wood floor as I crept toward the door. The tapping stopped. For a moment there was silence, so thick I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. On the other side, I heard something move, not footsteps exactly. It was more like a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the porch. Then came a faint scratching, almost like nails scraping against the wood. And then, a voice. It wasn't a voice meant for human ears. It was low and guttural, the words distorted, stretched into something that sounded wrong. Come, out. The air in the room seemed to vanish as panic surged through me. I scrambled back toward my bed, throwing myself under the covers like they could shield me. The voice didn't speak again, but the scratching grew louder, moving along the walls of the cabin. Whatever it was circling us. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blanket, willing it to stop. For what felt like hours, I lay there, heart racing, as the sounds continued. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking to sunlight streaming through the window. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I sat up, blinking against the harsh light, and looked around. My parents' bed was empty, the blankets neatly folded. The air smelled faintly of coffee, and I heard faint voices outside. For a brief moment I thought maybe it had all been a dream. But then I saw the door. The wooden surface was covered in scratches, deep and jagged, as if claws had raked across it. And in the center, carved into the wood, was a single word: come. I rushed outside, desperate to find my parents. The resort looked normal, families laughing and chatting as they ate breakfast on picnic tables. But something felt off. When I finally found my mom and dad near the bonfire pit, I tried to tell them about the door, about the voice, but they brushed it off like always. Scratches? Probably a raccoon, my dad said, sipping his coffee. You're working yourself up over nothing. My mom, sensing my frustration, leaned in and smiled. Why don't you go explore the gift shop? Take your mind off things. It's just over the hill, near the lake. Reluctantly, I agreed. Anything to get away from their dismissive tone. The gift shop was small, tucked near the edge of the resort property. It was empty when I walked in, the faint scent of cedar filling the air. The shelves were lined with tacky souvenirs, keychains, mugs, postcards. But something about the place felt wrong. The cashier's desk was unattended, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out the sunlight. The only light came from a single bulb that flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows. And then I saw it. In the back corner, standing between two shelves of novelty hats, was the figure. It was closer now, its pale skin glistening under the flickering light. Its hollow eyes stared straight at me, and its mouth, its grotesque, jagged smile, curved wider as I took an involuntary step back. It raised one hand, long fingers curling toward me, and spoke in that same guttural voice. You didn't listen. My legs gave out and I hit the floor hard. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in the silent shop. Desperate, I crawled backward, my hands scrambling against the wooden floor. My back hit the wall, and I realized there was nowhere to go. The figure loomed over me, its smile stretching impossibly wide. "Do you understand now?" it rasped, its voice reverberating inside my head. Just as it reached for me, the light bulb flickered one last time and went out. Ndi-kamu. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, lying on the grass near the bonfire pit. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the resort. My mom and dad were standing over me, their faces etched with worry. "What happened?" my mom asked, kneeling beside me. "You've been gone all day. We've been looking everywhere." I couldn't find the words. All I could do was glance toward the gift shop, but it was gone. In its place was an overgrown patch of grass, as if it had never existed. I didn't sleep that night, and when we left the resort the next morning, I didn't look back. Years later, I still can't explain what happened at that resort. Sometimes, I convince myself it was all in my head, a mix of childish imagination and Halloween jitters. But other times I wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I can hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And in those moments, I wonder if I ever truly left that place, or if it followed me home. Years later, I still wake up to the sound of faint tapping, always wondering if it's my imagination, or if it's still waiting for me. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more terrifying tales. You don't want to miss what's lurking in the shadows.